Valerie Neal is curator emerita at the in the Department of Space History at Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where she oversaw the human spaceflight collections from the Space Shuttle and International Space Station programs. Her previous books include Discovery, Champion of the Space Shuttle Fleet, and Spaceflight in the Shuttle Era and Beyond. But today, she is on a mission. Let's welcome Valerie Neal.
Thank you, Ashley. And thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon. It's a pleasure to see you, and I appreciate your coming. I'm going to talk with you all about a subject that I'm quite passionate about, and I hope by the end of the talk you'll be kind of passionate about it too. And that is about our U.S. women astronauts. Another question, and if you know the right answer, if you read the blurb for this talk, hold back before you answer, because I want to see what other answers might come up first. How many women astronauts do you think there have been in the United States? How many NASA women astronauts? Any guesses? Okay, do all of you know the right answer then? Does anybody know the right answer? Yes, thank you. Thank you for reading the blurb, if that's how you knew. 61 U.S. women have been astronauts or currently are astronauts. And when you think about that, that's like 2 whole classrooms full of women. If you think of it like a teacher or a student might think of it. But most people don't know who they are, can only name a few of them. And most of the people I have asked this question of have guessed at most 20, only a third of the actual number of astronauts. So our goal today is to learn more about those 61 and also get a sense of why it's important to remember them, because in the shuttle era, there were so many astronauts that most of them didn't receive a lot of public acclaim unless they were the first to do something. But whether you're the first or you're the 10th, it's still important what you've achieved and what you've done. So by the end of this talk, I hope you'll go out here with a few more names in your memory and maybe a few stories about them. So let's get started here. Believe it or not, there was a time when there were no women astronauts. And in fact, as you can see, there have been a total of almost 400 astronauts in NASA since the beginning, which was 1959 when the Mercury 7 were selected. But women were not recruited until almost 20 years later and not selected until 1978. So from the time that women could enter the astronaut corps, there have been 287 more astronauts added to those who were selected in the 1960s. And they were selected for missions on space shuttles, space stations, and on the craft that are now flying, and eventually, maybe as early as later this year, to the moon. But only 61 of those have been women. And they didn't all come in at the same time, obviously. They came into the astronaut corps over a period of 45 years. So they were never all astronauts together. They came into the astronaut corps 2 or 3 at a time in each recruitment class, sometimes as many as 8 or 10 in a recruitment class. And so think of them as being spread out over time. And there are 6 more new ones who were just selected, and they're in training now, and in another year or so will be fully eligible for selection to a mission. So that is only 21% of the astronaut corps has been female. On the other hand, today the astronaut corps is much smaller than it used to be. At its peak, it was 150 astronauts right around the turn of the century. Today, that number is only 40 because there are fewer missions to fly and the missions are longer. So you don't need as many people in the astronaut corps for missions to the space station or eventually to the moon. This picture on the right is one of my favorite ones because it shows a time when there were 4 women in space at the same time. 3 women who were coming up to the International Space Station as members of a shuttle crew, and they're wearing blue. And then the one who is wearing black was already a resident crew member on the International Space Station. And that mission occurred in, what year was it, Dottie? 2010? Okay, 2010. So it took that long before there were 4 women in space at the same time. The first time there were 2 women in space at the same time was 1984, and that's when Sally Ride and Kathy Sullivan were in space together. This patch was designed for the first 6 women who were selected in 1978, and it's a wonderful celebration of female astronauts depicted there in the center wearing both an in-flight uniform, the shorts and the polo shirt, and wearing an extravehicular activity suit to go out on a spacewalk. That had not happened yet. The first spacewalk hadn't happened, but the designer in the patch foresaw that women were going to be doing spacewalks too. And then the symbol you see behind them, the 3 rays from the star, is the symbol for the astronaut corps. It's a takeoff or a variant of the Vitruvian man symbol, which is the human figure in a circle with all the proportions in relation to one another, and that happens to be the basic symbol for extravehicular activity as well. So I said there have been 61. Here are their names. Your name might have been up there too, had you been born at the right time to be selected. And I love seeing this list in part because you see the great variety of feminine names there, but you can also kind of see the names of those who were born in the 1950s versus those who were born in the 1980s, just by the popularity of the names. I was born around 1950, and in my cohort growing up, there were a lot of Kathys and Lindas and Sandys. Names like that were very popular in the 1950s. By the 1980s, we were getting some more exotic names. Jessica became popular, Nicole became popular. Xena, I'm not sure how popular it is yet in the society, but that's the name of one of our newer astronauts. And so just this, I think, gives you a sense of the female cohort in the astronaut corps. So the purpose of the book that I have written, and that is the basis for the talk today, is to introduce all of the U.S. women astronauts between the covers of one book. There was no book that I could find that dealt with all of them. As soon as the book was published, it was already outdated because these 6 other women and a couple of the women that I do treat in the book had now had their first mission or their second mission. So some of the statistics in my book are already a little bit out of date, but that's okay. We want them to be out of date, right? We want those numbers to keep growing. I also wanted to deal with a social and historical context for women astronauts within the broader context of what was happening in our country, in our society between the 1940s and today, and how did that have an effect on the women who wanted to be astronauts or who in fact became astronauts. And at the same time, NASA was evolving. From the 1960s, when it was brand new and it was focused on getting men into orbit for the first time and eventually getting men on the moon by the end of that decade, to NASA in the 1970s and 80s, which was all about establishing a permanent presence in space on shuttle missions, doing useful work in space, and building a space station. And then from 1990s on, the space station became the focus for NASA. And each of these eras, NASA was looking for different capabilities in their astronauts. And that affected also the women who were applying and were selected. And the latest classes of astronauts have been selected primarily to be the ones who will return us to the moon. They may do a stint on the space station as part of their training, but their real goal in the program is to get to the moon. And if things keep progressing, in a few years there will be another selection of astronauts also for the moon, and then after that another selection of astronauts possibly for a mission to Mars. I wanted to place these women within that unfolding story. And if you read the book, you'll find that story interwoven throughout it. The real inspiration for how I organized the book into generations of women astronauts was an event that happened in 2012 after Sally Ride had died. And there is a tradition at NASA that when an astronaut or another major leader of the space program dies, there's a memorial grove at the Johnson Space Center that is planted with live oak trees, which are native to Texas, and they stay green all year round, and a very popular tree there. And it was time for Sally's tree to be planted, and her sister and her sister's family had come to Texas to be there for the planting ceremony. And the astronaut office had the idea to host the sister by gathering together as many women astronauts who wanted to attend or could attend to have dinner with her sister and her family that previous evening. And so these are the 20 or so women who were able to attend that. And it turned out that it was a real revelation to them because there were members of the first astronaut class to have women, and there were members of the latest astronaut class to have women, and there were members from every astronaut class in between, except one. And they didn't all know each other. Some of them had already left NASA, some of them had just arrived, some of them had been too far apart in their arrival at NASA to have known each other. So it turned out to be kind of like a reunion event, but it was also an introductory event. And as they had dinner together, they went around the table and everyone shared a memory of Sally Ride. And at the same time, they also talked about one another. For example, if Sally Ride had been an inspiration to one of the astronauts who had joined the Corps in the 1990s, she might have said, I really admired Sally Ride and Kathy Sullivan and Anna Fisher from that first class. They were my role models. And the women from that first class had never known that. They didn't know what an inspiration they had been to the younger astronauts. And some of them had no idea how accomplished some of the newer astronauts were, to the point that they even said, if I applied today, I would probably never make it, because the newer astronauts were coming in with like 10 years of military experience behind them. They were jet fighter pilots, they were helicopter pilots, they had been leaders in the military service they were a member of. They had done 6 months to a year-long missions in Antarctica doing research. They had done things that the earliest women hadn't had a chance to do. And it was really an eye-opening experience. And so after talking with some of them about this dinner and the fact that they realized that they kind of belonged to different generations, I decided that was how I would organize the book. The question arises, why did it take 20 whole years before women were brought into the astronaut corps, before women were recruited into the astronaut corps? What was going on during that period of the 1960s and 1970s? And the answer is a tremendous amount of change was going on. Women who were born in the 1950s and came of age in the 1960s were just ahead of the civil rights movement and the women's movement that opened up all kinds of career opportunities that had not been available before. Women in the 60s were the 50s were largely expected to stay home, take care of the family. If they had a job at all, it was as a teacher or a nurse, or maybe they worked in a business, a hair salon, or another service business, but they really didn't have expectations of having college degrees and professions in the sciences, in engineering, in medicine, in law. All of those were still largely closed to women. And so it took a lot of change in the 1960s and 70s before those doors began to open. Engineering schools just would not admit women. In general, there were a couple that would, but they were really discouraged because professors didn't think that girls would stick to the rigorous program, that they weren't strong enough in math. They just had these generalized ideas about girls versus boys. They even thought that having girls in the classroom would distract the boys and cause a problem in the classroom. So believe it or not, women were actually told, no, I'm not going to let you enter my course. I'm not going to let you take my course. You don't belong. And some of the women who were selected as astronauts actually faced that in their youth, and they had to fight against those obstacles and just push their way in because they had confidence that they could handle it. We had these social expectations. We had restrictions on technical education in that early period, and also, though many, many women were pilots and could fly small aircraft, who could compete in aviation contests and were good enough pilots to set records, win races and that sort of thing, women were not flying jets yet. They were not flying commercial aircraft, and they certainly were not flying military aircraft because the military had a barrier against women. And that barrier did not start to fall until 1974, and it didn't completely fall until about 2002, when women were finally allowed to fly any plane that was in the military inventory. So that's 4 decades worth of an obstacle to overcome. We also had barriers to participation in various kinds of activities that were barred by law or barred by policy. And one of the oddest ones, I think, was that for a time, women could not compete in the Boston Marathon because it was believed that their female organs would be damaged and might fall out of their bodies, and nobody wanted to put them through that. Or they felt that women were just inherently unstable when it came to decision-making and sophisticated thought processes, and that at least once a month you couldn't count on a woman to be reasonable and rational and steady. And so you certainly couldn't put her in the cockpit of a high-value aircraft. These kinds of conceptions had to be fought against with data and with experience and with proof that these were not issues for women to participate. They seem laughable now, but they were real. And it makes us think of some of the beliefs we have today about, if not gender issues, about other issues that might have to do with professional abilities. May seem laughable in time, too. We are all creatures of the era we live in, and the 1950s, early 1960s was a hard time for women who had ambitions and who wanted to break out of the ordinary molds. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, and new laws and policies had to take place, and that was a slow, cumulative process. The curtain didn't just raise all at once, and suddenly all those barriers were gone and all the doors were open. It was a long, slow process. and things like the Civil Rights Act of 1974, the Women's Rights in Education, Equal Opportunity in Education Act, also in the 1960s, all were necessary stepping stones to getting closer to real equality in the professional world. I mentioned that the first women astronauts were selected in 1978. They were part of a group of 35 astronauts. All the rest were men. But that particular group was a really pioneering group because not only did it include 6 women, it included African Americans and an Asian American as well. Those 2 groups had never been able to participate in spaceflight either. And what made the real difference, what really opened the door within NASA, was the development of the space shuttle, a whole different kind of spacecraft. Remember the capsules of the 1960s that men flew in orbit or to the moon and back? Were very small. They were about the size of a compact car. They had no privacy. Whatever they did, whether it was eating or sleeping or eliminating waste from their body, they did it in the presence of each other. And nobody at that time would have ever imagined putting a woman in that kind of spacecraft with 2 men because of the lack of privacy. It would just have been very unseemly. And quite possibly no woman would have wanted to do that either. But the space shuttle, as you know from the display across the street, has a much larger crew cabin, something more like the equivalent of a couple of family vans stacked on top of each other. So there was room there to have a larger crew and to have a little bit of privacy, at least the privacy of a proper toilet instead of plastic bags, and a curtain that could be drawn for privacy. So if you were modest, you could step behind the curtain to change clothes, or you could do your business without everybody else being aware of it. And so that element of more space and privacy made it possible to imagine women being on a crew. But even more important, the job of the space shuttle crews changed, and NASA introduced a new kind of astronaut who would be a scientist or an engineer as a mission specialist. Not all of the astronauts had to be pilots anymore, or military test pilots in particular. So you needed 2 pilots to fly the shuttle, but you had room in the shuttle for up to 6 more people who could be scientists, engineers, and do the work of the mission, do the experiments, deploy the satellites, operate the robotic arm that lifted payloads in and out of the shuttle bay. And that opened up the pool of eligible people considerably, because there were a lot more scientists and engineers in the country than there were military test pilots. That opened the door to women. That opened the door to a lot of men as well, who were not military test pilots. So these women were the first to break through and break into the astronaut corps. And as you mentioned earlier, you know most of their names. On the front row here, we have Sally Ride, who was an astrophysicist, Ray Seddon, who was a medical doctor, a surgeon, and then on the back row, we have Kathy Sullivan, a geologist and ocean scientist, Shannon Lucet, who was a biochemist, Anna Fisher, who was an emergency room physician, and then Judy Resnick on the right, who was an electrical engineer. All of these women came in with advanced degrees. All of them flew their first missions in the 1980s and really proved beyond a doubt that women could do the job of being an astronaut. Now, they faced some skepticism when they were selected. It was clear that NASA wanted them to be in the astronaut corps and to be treated as equals, but some of the old-timers, some of the leftover astronauts from the 1960s had their doubts, as did some of the other engineers throughout NASA, and they weren't persuaded until they saw them fly and realized that they could, in fact, do the job. Now, one of the women, Shannon Lucid, was the eldest of the ones who came in, and Sally Ride and Kathy Sullivan were the youngest. They were 26. Shannon was 35. Shannon was married and already had 3 children. And when the journalists met with this group upon their selection, they were all just so worried about what Shannon was going to do about her children when she went off into space. Like, what kind of mother would leave her kids on Earth and go into space? Well, men astronauts had been doing that for 20 years. Nobody had asked them, how can you leave your children behind? But Shannon took a lot of questions about that. She ended up being the first woman to spend hundreds of days in space for the United States when she did a tour of duty on the Russian space station Mir. I should say her children all turned out perfectly well, very normal family life. Their dad was a very capable parent too, and they rather enjoyed it when their mom was in space. They sent her care packages and books to read and stayed in touch with her daily. So there was no detriment to her family. The media focused initially on the ones they thought were the cutest, Anna Fisher and Ray Seddon. They were petite, they were pretty, they were doctors. They actually were written about in articles that listed their weight and their measurements, if you can believe that. No male astronaut was ever written about in terms of his physical appearance, but the women had to put up with that sort of thing too at the beginning. Anyway, these were the pioneers and the ones who ended up becoming the role models for everyone else. This is just a glimpse of what I call the first generation of women astronauts, the trailblazers, and they were all born before 1960. And you can see that they're coming into the astronaut corps every couple of years, and they are all scientists or medical doctors. As we get a little further along, we have several of them who do end up becoming spacewalkers. Kathy Sullivan was first, and then Kathy Thornton, and then Linda Godwin, Tammy Jernigan, and Susan Helms all ended up becoming spacewalkers during their career. You'll see Mae Jemison was selected in 1987 as the first African-American woman in the astronaut corps. And then in 1990, something different happened. The first women were selected directly out of the military: Eileen Collins, Susan Helms, and Nancy Sherlock Curry. Eileen and Susan were both from the Air Force. Nancy Curry was from the Army. She was a helicopter pilot. Susan Helms was a flight test engineer, and Eileen Collins was a test pilot. So Eileen really broke that last barrier to being an astronaut when she became the first woman test pilot to enter the Corps. Then we have the next group of women, and these were all born in the 1960s. They were born and came of age during that period of ferment where the doors were opening for women, and if you aspired to be an astronaut, you could pursue an education that could qualify you, or you could pursue the military experience that would qualify you. It was during the 1970s that the military academies were open to women, and that jobs within the military that had been men only began to open to women, particularly jobs in aviation. Before that time, you could serve as an air traffic controller, or you could serve as a ground crew, or as a mechanic. a technician, but you couldn't be a pilot. And that began to change in the 1970s. And so again, you'll see different women coming in at different times. The class that had the most women in it was the class of 1996. It also was another 35-member class. But you can see there are 8 women in that class. And you also have more African Americans coming into the astronaut corps. Joan Higginbotham and Stephanie Wilson. Stephanie became the second African American woman to go into space, and she's still active in the astronaut corps, and she's still in the group that's eligible to be assigned for a mission to the moon. NASA has committed to sending a woman and a person of color to the moon. The first mission, which may be launched this year, if they can overcome some troubles with the spacecraft, has a woman on board and an African-American man. They aren't going to land. They're going to do a big loop around the moon and check out all the systems. But NASA has also said it will send a woman and a person of color to land on the moon, and that could occur next year. And Stephanie can check both of those boxes, right? So I think she has a decent chance. She's right now the senior ranking African-American woman in the astronaut corps. She has been in the astronaut corps since 1996. Joan Higginbotham has already left NASA. And let's see. Kalpana Chawla was of native Indian descent. She had grown up in India, wanted to be an astronaut all her life, came to the United States to get her graduate degree in engineering, flew 2 missions, and unfortunately, her second mission was the last Columbia mission when she perished during return on that mission. But you start to see there is some more diversity coming into the astronaut group. Barbara Morgan became the first teacher in space to follow Krista McAuliffe, who was the designated teacher in space who died on the Challenger accident. And then we have this third generation. They were mostly born in the 70s and do not include the latest class that was selected in 2025. These women are amazingly impressive. All of them came in to the astronaut corps with a solid 10-year career behind them, either in the military or in the world of research. And they're doing very different kinds of jobs in the military. One was a Marine salvage person. One was a flight medical doctor, not flight medical doctor, a medical doctor for submariners. One has managed an oil rig, the only woman on an oil rig, and she's running the show. They are flying in combat. They have flown the newest, the hottest jets that the military has to offer. They have served as leaders of rank already, so they just are coming in immensely qualified and rivaling any kinds of credentials that men had in the past. So it's great to see them here. We also have a little bit more diversity showing up in the astronaut corps too, like Jasmine Moghbeli is of Persian descent, and Serena Onion Chancellor of Puerto Rican ancestry. Jeanette Epps is another African-American woman in space. And let's see, Jessica Watkins also is African-American. And then here are the names of the ones who are in training right now. So I think the future looks bright for these women. Almost all of these are still in the astronaut corps, and their careers are not over yet. Astronauts don't spend all their time in space. They have many jobs on the ground, in the air, and in space. And this is just a sampling of the kinds of jobs they hold during their time in in the astronaut corps, and it's grueling work, very demanding, a lot of late hours, a lot of travel, not only travel when you're in space, but a lot of travel when you're in training all around the world. And most of them do have family. About half the women astronauts have children and have had children since they became astronauts. A few, like Shannon, came in with children already, but that's a lot to manage all at once, and they're doing that very well. Of course, male astronauts have family too, and they have children, but societally, still the expectation is that the women are the primary parent, the primary caregivers. And so astronaut families have to negotiate within the marriage how they're going to manage parenting to allow for the mom to have the kind of time away from home that she needs in order to be trained and go into space. I wanted to point out a couple of Washington's famed astronauts. I would say their prima astronaut is Bonnie Dunbar, who was born and reared in Washington, went to the University of Washington for her undergraduate and master's degrees, was the first woman to graduate in ceramics engineering at the University of Washington. Later, she worked at Boeing and Rockwell, and then she went to NASA and worked for a year or two before she was selected into the astronaut corps. Now, Bonnie is one of these people who was told at an early age that she shouldn't aspire to engineering or even a college education. Her high school guidance counselor in Sunnyvale evidently, but according to Bonnie's memory, suggested that she not invest herself in a college education, but just remain on the farm where she had grown up, in the farm community. Her parents had homesteaded a ranch or a farm out in eastern Washington, and she was used to doing farm girl chores. And her guidance counselor said, you know how to do that, just stay here and do it. Well, Bonnie had other ideas, and she really wanted to go to Caltech or to MIT and study engineering, but they weren't accepting women yet. She also wanted to get into ROTC to help pay for her education, but ROTC wasn't accepting women yet. So she ended up going to the University of Washington here with scholarship help, and she had a couple of really good mentors within the engineering school who made sure that she got a quality education and quality work experience that she could take out into the world with her. And as a result, she was selected as an astronaut. She's one of only 6 women who have flown in space 5 times. She held leadership positions as science commander of missions, which is like the equivalent of being the commander of the mission, except just for the payload operations, the scientific experiments and such, the real work of the mission. So she rose to that level as science commander of her missions, and then she moved on into higher level management at NASA, and really was one of the outstanding of the early astronauts. She left NASA in 2005, and look where she came. Right here, to head up this museum, which she did for 5 years. And then she got involved in another project here in Washington, and then she moved back to Texas to teach and to lead programs at the University of Houston and at Texas A&M. And she's still doing that today. She's not even close to retiring as far as I can tell. But truly somebody that Washingtonians should be proud of. And if you don't know her name, I hope you will remember her name when you leave here today. And here's another Washingtonian who is a stellar astronaut. And though she didn't grow up in Washington, she went to college here at Whitman College, and then later at the University of Washington got her master's degree in geology. She taught high school in Vancouver, and she was selected to be an astronaut in 2004. and flew on a shuttle mission to the International Space Station in 2010. And her name is Dottie Metcalf Lindenberger. And I had shown you this picture before. Here is Dottie as one of the 4 on the space station in 2010. And I love this picture. I looked for pictures of women astronauts with their families so I could help make the point that, you know, they're moms like anybody else. They have normal lives, you know, as moms and wives. They have children that they have to leave behind to go to space. But I thought this was so touching of them on their way home after her return from space. And to me, it was a very tender moment between mother and daughter. Some other Washington-affiliated astronauts are these. Yvonne Kagel earned her medical degree here. Janet Cavandi earned her PhD in chemistry here. And then Wendy Lawrence and Heidi Stephanician Piper both retired to Washington when they left NASA. So you all have a claim on at least 6 of the 61 women astronauts. And maybe as time goes by, there will be more. But especially remember Bonnie Dunbar and Dottie Metcalf Lindenberger. And I should say Dottie's even on the board of this museum and helping to make it the wonderful institution that it is. Military women come from all ranks of the military, and about a third of the women have come directly into the astronaut corps as military officers, many of them as pilots, a few as flight test engineers. And you can see the distribution there. And I like this picture because at least once, 3 of them were on the space station together and were showing off their paraphernalia. I think now most of the women who are coming into the astronaut corps are coming in from the military. The last class had just 2 scientists and all the rest were military women. And I think that may be because the military provides such good training in leadership, character development, project management, all kinds of skills that astronauts need. And you just can't get that caliber of training many other places than in the military. And every now and then a congressman or someone in public life will say, why aren't you taking women from other backgrounds? And I think the answer is that to get to the level of achievement that is required today, the military is the strongest path to get there. We've had 6 African-American women astronauts, and Mae Jemison, you mentioned before, the first of them. Stephanie Wilson, who has flown 3 times on the Space Shuttle and once on the International Space Station. Jessica Watkins is one of the younger, newer ones, has been on the space station once already. Joan Higginbotham, who was the 3rd African-American woman, and Jeanette Epps, who waited 15 years to get her first assignment. There were some kind of issues along the way where there were crew changes and there were postponements and one thing and another. So it took her 15 years to get her assignment, but she patiently stuck it out and she flew to the space station on a SpaceX mission. And then Yvonne Kagel is a little bit different from the others in that she never did fly in space. She was part of that 1996 class, and it took a long time to get all of them assigned to a mission. And at some point, she decided that while she was waiting, she was going to take an interim appointment at another NASA center in California, the Ames Research Center. And she went there and she stayed there. She's still there today, unless she's retired. But she's been very active in life science research at Ames, which is one of NASA's primary centers for that. And all of the women who are out of the astronaut corps now do a lot of public speaking and a lot of public appearances at community events, at conferences, at schools, and that sort of thing. So you might have a chance to hear them at some point. And I was delighted when I found this picture because, once again, it shows that astronaut women are just normal women. You know, they can be glamorous, they can dress up and go out and receive honors and awards. There are other pictures of women astronauts engaged in whatever sport it is they like to play, volleyball or soccer or tennis, whatever. They're exceptional women, but they're also normal women, if that makes sense. They do the kinds of things all of us do. Also, some women of Hispanic, Native American, or Asian heritage. Ellen Ochoa was the first Hispanic American woman in the astronaut corps. She flew her missions and then she moved up into management. She ended up as director of the Johnson Space Center in Houston. She's only the second woman to achieve that level of leadership. Kalpana, we talked about, unfortunately perishing on Columbia's last mission. Sunita Williams of Indian heritage, and she's one of, as you can see, one of the highest ranking women in the astronaut corps with 9 spacewalks to her credit. And she has 9 spacewalks, but she's only about an hour, I think it's an hour or two ahead of Peggy Whitson, who has 10. Peggy Whitson leads the world as a woman who has done spacewalk. She is number 8 on the all-time list of women who have done spacewalking. She has more than 60 hours outside a spacecraft, and she has more than 600 hours in space altogether. So she's remarkable. And on the previous slide, I had wanted to mention, Serena Onion Chancellor, who is a medical doctor, a flight surgeon, and then Nicole Anapu-Mann, who is a member of a Native American tribe in California. So she's our first Native American woman astronaut. So women have brought diversity into the astronaut corps. These are the women who have been spacewalkers. That is a highly coveted job. Not everyone wants it, but almost everyone wants it, to have the chance to go outside the spacecraft in the white EVA suit and do work that's difficult and dangerous, but easier to do in space's minimal gravity, like being able to move around big pieces of equipment and such. So people really covet those spacewalking jobs. And Jessica Meir and Christina Koch were the first 2 women to do a spacewalk together. And you can tell from these pictures that they're loving it, getting their tools ready and their spacesuits ready to go outside, and then experiencing the actual job of doing the spacewalk. So you're not picked for a spacewalk based on your gender. You're picked based on your skill and your capability. And it just so happened that on the space station at this time, there were 2 women who met those criteria for doing a spacewalk. It wasn't really planned to be a stunt, like let's fly 2 women and have them both do a spacewalk. They were the 2 on the flight who were the most qualified to do it. And since it's happened a couple of more times, it's now a norm. No big deal if 2 women are doing a spacewalk together, just as it was no big deal when 2 men were doing a spacewalk together, right? Or a man and a woman doing a spacewalk together. And just to put a little capstone on this, women are some of our best record holders in space, and you can see here how they compare with men in those same categories. Peggy Whitson is far and away the most accomplished American woman astronaut, both in terms of her time in space and her number of spacewalks. Christina Koch, who is much younger, holds the record for the longest continuous time in space. And you can see these are comparable. between the men and the women. So I think we can say with confidence that America's women have earned their place in space. They have proven their capability in every job that there is to be done in space. And there will never again be any doubt about women having the ability to carry out space missions. There should be no doubt about women being able to be crew members to the moon or to Mars. Or if some other wildly difficult profession opens up that's very demanding, very dangerous, very rigorous, there should be no doubt that women can handle the job. So that's the point of my book, and that's the point of my talk this afternoon. And we want to have time for some questions, if you have them. And I would like to invite Dottie Metcalf Lindenberger up here on stage with me today to field questions. I had the privilege of just meeting her today over lunch. We had a delightful conversation, and she's definitely an astronaut you should know about.
Hi, Valerie. Hi, Dottie. I did have a question specifically for Valerie, because I bet you interviewed so many of these female astronauts. Who had the most surprising story for you, like a story that you didn't see coming in your career? And then who is the most exciting person to talk to for yourself personally?
Those are hard questions to answer because all the interviews were good and there were a lot of surprises. I will say I didn't get to interview the newer active duty astronauts, so that's my big regret. NASA protects them from the media and from writers like me, so I didn't get to interview anybody who's still on active duty. Of the ones I did interview, I think Peggy Whitson may have been the most surprising because she also grew up as a farm girl in, I think it was, was it Iowa? Yeah, I was trying to think if it's Iowa or Kansas. She grew up on a farm in a small community. She wanted to be an astronaut forever. She applied 4 times and each time got the nice rejection letter. And finally, on the 5th time she was chosen, she's ended up rising to the top of all the women astronauts and a lot of the men astronauts in terms of numbers of missions and spacewalks and that sort of thing. And she said that it didn't discourage her to be turned down, that each time she was turned down, she tried to figure out what else she needed to do, what else she needed, what other skills she needed, what other experience she needed. And I think finally they just couldn't help but choose her. Now, the one who was most exciting to talk to, that's hard, but I would say probably my personal admiration goes to Kathy Sullivan because she now holds the Guinness Book of Records title for the person who has traveled the most vertical distance on our planet. She was on the Hubble Space Telescope deployment mission, which went higher than the other shuttle missions. And then just a couple of years ago, she went down into the Challenger Deep in the Pacific Ocean in a submersible. And so she's kind of covered all that area. She's an explorer by nature. She was an oceanographer and had planned for that to be her career. But basically, when she was in high school, she decided she wanted to find a career that would pay her to travel because she loved to travel.
And if it's okay, I'll ask a question for Dottie as well. When you see the story about the women astronauts meeting each other during Sally Ride's tree planting, is there any specific occasion with other women astronauts that really hits you or that you've had in the past that kind of resonates with you?
Yes, well, I did have that opportunity. I was in that picture as well. But I was just telling Valerie over lunch that when I was selected with Shannon, and Naoko was also in my class, but of course not in the book because she's from Japan. But 3 of us came, and Janice Voss held this really nice dinner for all of us women that were currently in the office or just joining the office, which was a very special event. And so I was looking through pictures, and that popped up from that dinner this week, and I thought, wow, Bonnie's in that picture. Wendy Lawrence, who I really wish could have been here today. Wendy has done so much for this Museum of Flight as well, and she continues to volunteer here and has been honored by the museum. And I'm trying to think, Ellen Ochoa was in that. I mean, there's just a lot of really accomplished women that were on the list here, but I got a chance they really made us feel welcome as the 3 new women to the office in 2004.
Thank you so much.
Follow up on that. First of all, asking Dottie a little bit about what was the seed planted for you that said, you know, my future's an astronaut. But secondly, are there still prove it, you know, kind of milestones for me? I feel this whole museum shows how women were underestimated and, you know, had to do a lot more to prove their worth in flight at every stage. And I just wonder if there's still some stages that feel like that.
Well, yes, this museum has great reminders, and I actually, a couple of years ago, took a tour during the pandemic that talked about women in aviation, where women have been able to do a lot more flight, like in the Soviet Union and in Germany, before we finally were getting to do more of it here in the United States. I guess as far as, I think you really hit upon it, is that spacewalking for the longest time was one of those prove it. And it's not really because women can't do it. It's because the suits that we have on the International Space Station are not for the sizes of all women, and for some men too. And so that becomes a very frustrating barrier that is not in control, and is hopefully this piece that is going to be solved as we return to the moon. They've incorporated many women in the testing of these suits, and they've used different body sizes and arm reaches, but that just wasn't it. In fact, another Washington astronaut who grew up in Spokane area, Anne McLean, she was actually going to be in the team of first 2 women, but realized for safety and called the ground and said, you know, I cannot be in this suit. It's not the safest one for me. And therefore she removed herself from the all-woman spaceflight. And so then later we get Christina and Jessica being able to do that spacewalk. So suit has been a big limiter, and it will be until we finally get to return to the moon. Because we just can't replace those right now. That, first of all, the space station is retiring pretty soon, and also suits are expensive, and making them and flying them is very expensive.
And some of the women were very candid in talking to me about that suit issue, to the point that they felt like it might have even been a conspiracy to keep them out of spaceflight, because men do have certain advantages of longer arms, longer legs, more upper body strength, but a lot of that is negated when you're in microgravity. It helps to have the length, but you can still move the mass around, and particularly after training, to do that sort of thing underwater. So some of the women felt like some of the men were kind of trying to hoard spacewalk for themselves, and were kind of agitating not to replace the smaller suit or to redesign the smaller suit. I did talk to one of the men who was a leading spacewalker himself. His point of view is, we tried everything we could to accommodate the smaller women, but at some point it doesn't make sense to spend that much more money to accommodate a very small population. You know, because a lot of the women could wear a medium suit. I don't think any woman wore a large. But at one point, NASA had decided, for budgetary reasons, to cancel the extra large suit and cancel the small suit. And the men lobbied to keep the extra large because they needed it. but the women lobbying to keep the small suit didn't succeed, and so it was finally dropped out of the inventory. And that's what some of them are still resentful about, because they said that sent the signal that we weren't worth it. And they asked me to write about it a little more diplomatically than that, but that's how they talked about it.
And how did I decide to be an astronaut? I had a kind of a lucky experience too. So my initial is that I was inspired by Sally Ride and Catherine Sullivan. So that first class of women is really significant in inspiring me, because in 1983, when Sally Ride becomes the first American woman to fly in space, I'm a third grader, and which we watch third graders, and that's really when they start to think about what's possible for themselves. So having women in the 1978 class was so important. I came out here to Washington to study at Whitman. I'm a geologist by training. I intended to go the full PhD route to become an astronaut. Some things happened in my life while trying to go that route, like going to the Peace Corps was one of my, right out of undergrad, that I had been assigned. But 1 month before I was supposed to go, the country I was assigned to became unstable, and I wasn't allowed to go. So I was supposed to go to Kazakhstan, and then I wasn't able to go. It's the early internet days, and finding quick jobs or anything like that to pivot to in that short amount of time, I decided to pivot to what my parents had done initially, which is to be educators as well. So I went back to school at Central Washington and became a high school earth science and astronomy teacher. And so the luck part is that in the class of 2004, after hiring Barbara Morgan in 1998, they hired 3 of us as teachers, and I was brought in that class, along with Jose and other many talented astronauts.
Do you have a favorite memory of being in space?
Well, I have lots of favorite memories, but I usually focus on 3 things, because professionally we did work really hard to become astronauts, and the training, the initial training is about 1.5 years for shuttle astronauts. For ISS astronauts, it's about 2 years, because they incorporate the spacewalk and robotic within that training, because it's a necessary skill. I took that after the training. And then another 1.5 years of training with my crew. So essentially 3 years of just training in simulators and flying in the T-38 to prepare for space. So when you do a successful mission and you know that the steps are coming together, and they don't come together perfectly, that's how spaceflight is, but when you feel it coming together, that is a truly wonderful memory. That's the professional part. As a geologist and earth scientist, looking back at Earth and seeing the beauty of Earth, I will never forget it. I'll never forget the first time I could pick out Crater Lake and then see all the volcanoes quickly. And thankfully, we had a beautiful April that year, so I could pick those out. And then, of course, I was once your age too, and I like to say that none of us are old, we're just young at heart. And floating and flipping around and being Superwoman is just an awesome experience too. So those are my 3 favorite things about being in space.
But a friend of mine, Frank White, has written a book called The Overview Effect. And every astronaut, I like to say every astronaut I have met and got to know was changed after their flight. And I want to ask you about your overview effect, if you could talk about that.
Yeah, every astronaut will be changed in some way when you look back at your own home planet for the first time. You can't help but remember it. And also, I think looking into the depths of space itself, and it's a very humbling experience. It's a very beautiful experience. There's just not words that capture all of it. But I think the big piece that we would say is that you look back at Earth, and that is what you feel really tied to, that you are a part of it, and you recognize like you're a part of all of it, not just a spot, but all of it. And that you have this privilege to be in space, but when you go back, you want to make it better on Earth too.
I think it's wonderful that we have women like Dottie and the other 60 women serving as representatives of humanity, and particularly representatives of the United States of America in space. I didn't deal with the other women from other countries, and there are a number of them from Canada, Japan, Europe, and Russia, but the United States far and away has the most female astronauts within the NASA astronaut corps and now within the commercial spaceflight world. The number of women going into space is just growing exponentially with the advent of commercial spaceflight. And our astronauts just represent all of us so well. I think you all are extraordinary people, but you're also, in many ways, just like the rest of us. You know, you have the same the hopes and dreams and roles in life, and you've just attained it all at a higher level. So thank you for your service.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you too for taking the time to really research and set the stage for the book. And I'm a lifelong learner, as all of you are too. And so I just think this was a great opportunity for all of us. And as I read through the book and reread, just to see those stories of the people that inspired me. So thanks so much, Valerie, for doing this and putting it all together in one place. And like we both talked about at lunch, I'm so glad it's already changing too, and that there's going to have to be someone that picks up after Valerie's book, or maybe you get to pick it up and just do the sequel.
We'll see. I think we're involved in different ways in the same enterprise, which is exploration and trying to advance human achievement. To me, space flight is the most exciting thing that humans have attempted since the age of exploration in the 14 and 1500s. And to be so fortunate to live in this time and to be able to actually do it or to document it, I just think it's such a blessing. And you know, she and I have lived very different lives, but I think we have a lot in common with our commitment to space flight and space exploration.